Okay, we're going to continue the Sicha that we started Friday in the general class and continue in this format and time frame and bring up the text. Okay, so this is the Farbrengen from Yud Shvat, Tafshin Chavvav, 1966. And what's significant about this year, and the reason we're learning this year's Yud Shvat, that the year of 1960 is Yud Shvat, because the Rebbe started to say Hasidic discourses on the 10th of Shvat when he accepted leadership, starting from 1951. And each year he explained one of the 20 chapters of the final groups of Hasidic discourses that his father-in-law gave out for the day of the Yahrzeit, meaning that the previous Rebbe had already edited Maimorim that were previously said to be given out on the 10th of Shvat and a few days after, and a period of time afterwards, because the 10th of Shvat was also the Yahrzeit, is also the Yahrzeit. The previous Rebbe's grandmother, Rebbetzin Rivka, the Rebbetzin of the Rebbe Marash, and when the Rebbe passed, the Previous Rebbe was Nifter on Yud Shvat, the next year the Rebbe started to explain every year one chapter of the 20 chapters of the Hemshech, of the groups of Maimorim under the title of Basi Lagan. This year, continuation is 20, so the first cycle finished in 1970, and then 70, then 70, then 90, etc. So we would be holding corresponding to the 16th chapter, where the Rebbe explained that in the Farbrengen, and the Maimorim of the year Tafshin Chavav, also in the year 1986. Tafshin Chavav is 66. So therefore we learned this Farbrengen and the Maimorim, which kind of gives us a mission statement for this year. In the beginning of the Sicha that we learned on Thursday night, the Rebbe spoke about the idea of starting off with the Rebbe quoting the idea that's brought down in Pirkei Avos that Nefraim min Adam midaitei Mishlei midaitei, that a person has to precondition for the negative and the positive. So by asking someone a negative idea, so then you pass judgment, then only then you yourself can be judged. And surely the same thing is positive. But the previous Rebbe is saying that there's no disconnect. When he crossed over from Russia, he meant to say there's never going to be a disconnect, including Yud Shvat. The Rebbe is asking the question, where we're holding now, how's that possible? When we know that there are things that happened on Yud Shvat. The previous Rebbe passed away, he was buried. So how can you say there's no Yaakov Avinu lo meis, Yaakov did not, there's no hefsek? The Rebbe didn't explain this idea of Yaakov Avinu lo meis, the mazar b'chaim afu b'chaim, and apply it to, obviously this is applicable to all tzaddikim of leadership, like in the way of a nasi, of a Rebbe, where there's the idea of mazar b'chaim afu b'chaim, which is a very deep concept. The Rebbe is explaining in the Sicha. So far, what we're holding in the Sicha, where the Rebbe is going to explain based on the idea of, from the Alter Rebbe's letter to the Hasidim of Eretz Yisrael after the passing of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradak, where the previous Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe writes in the letter in Igeres HaKodesh that's printed in the end of Tanya, that a tzaddik, and especially a nasi, although Rabbi Menachem Mendel was a nasi Chabad, but he was considered a nasi in some places, that a nasi is shavak chai l'chol chai, that the life of a tzaddik is chaim ruchnim, is spiritual. Because the life of a tzaddik is spiritual, therefore the tzaddik is still alive, and even more so, and giving more to those who are connected to him in his life and after his life, because he has less limitations now that he's passed away. He doesn't even have the limitations in the body. Is able to provide more. So there is a middle of explaining where we're holding now. We're going to stop. I think we're holding we're going to go back to top of page 25. Okay. So the Rebbe says like this. Yeah, we're going to go. We said this, but we're going to go back a bit. This letter from the Alter Rebbe, where he describes the idea of a tzaddik's life is chaim ruchim, is a spiritual life, and not chaim gashmim, and therefore the gashmistic passing away, so to say, of a tzaddik doesn't affect the real life of the tzaddik, because his life isn't spiritual, isn't physical. His life is spiritual. Because his life is spiritual, he lives more, and he lives stronger, and he's able to give more. He doesn't have the limitations of the physical body and the physical space. So 25. So the Rebbe is going to explain in a very deep idea, what does it mean, Mazari b'chaim, Afu b'chaim. So first we said already that doesn't mean that if the children are alive, it's as if the father is alive. The Avram Avinu is alive. Yaakov Avinu is alive. Right? Yaakov lay mace. The Gemara says Yaakov lay mace. The Gemara says, how can you say Yaakov didn't die? They anointed him, they buried him. So he says, the Gemara answers, Mazar b'chaim, Afu b'chaim. If his children are alive, he's alive. So the Rebbe says it doesn't mean, we already established, it doesn't mean that because his children are alive, it's as if he's alive. No. Just as you see his children alive, then he's alive. It's the same exact way. Like the Rebbe says, the expression Yiddish, not for Wasser, not to water down, and to try to say that we're talking about his legacy, his influence. You see the children alive, he's alive. And then the Sicha, the Rebbe is going to go deeper in this idea about actually flipping the whole narrative. And what does it mean, Ma'azar b'chaim, Afu b'chaim? So here first, so he's explaining it through the letter of the Alter Rebbe. So let's continue. Amna, the Geras HaKodesh Nan, this letter from the Alter Rebbe, which is printed again in the end of Tanya, in the Geras HaKodesh, where he writes a letter to the Chassidim that are mourning, so to say, the passing of the Rebbe Menachem Mendel Paradok, which was a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid and a colleague teacher of the Alter Rebbe. So before the Rebbe says, explains in this letter, it's not just that the tzaddik has a super life after he dies, but even as the tzaddik is found in this chayusa, he's found ba'ol modein in this world, his physical, that he's, like we said in the Sicha before, the tzaddik has to eat and can only make a bracha if he eats actual bread, if he eats lechem. If he wants to translate to lechem as being Torah, like it says, l'chu lachmu b'lachmi, that Torah is like lechem, and therefore I'm going to make a bracha on the spirituality of lechem called Torah. No, there's no mitzvah like that. You want to learn Torah, make a bracha, l'asik b'Torah. But for to make hamoitzi lechem in art, you have to eat bread. So it means the tzaddik has connection to the physicality. It says, hinegam agashmis, even this physicality that he has, it's ruchnius. Meaning, he explains, when a tzaddik makes a bracha, for instance, on when he eats, like I just said, in order for it to not be a bracha of waste, meaning a wasteful bracha, unnecessary bracha, it's obligatory that he's actually eating. In order for a tzaddik to make a moitzi lechem in the arts, he has to eat bread. You do not make a bracha on a spiritual idea. The bracha that you would say of eating bread. This bracha is for spiritual ideas, but that bracha of eating bread, you can't translate it and say that I'm taking in this spiritual idea of eating bread and I'm going to make a bracha on moitzi. Meaning, if when a tzaddik learns something in Torah, Torah is also called lachem. Like it says, the chul lachmu belachmi. Go take the bread, belachmi, my bread, the bread which is called Torah. Means when you study Torah, it's like a person who's eating bread, which means, and Chassidus explains, that Torah is something of pnimius. It's not a mitzvah which is makiv. It becomes like dam basar kibib, just like food changes the actual person. There's a different way of how clothing or shelter protect a person versus of how food goes into the person with pnimius, and it has to be digested in the proper way. If you open a person up and stick a loaf of bread in, the person will not only not live, will die. But when you consume bread properly, it becomes dam basar kibsar, it becomes part of you and becomes pnimius with you. And Torah affects the pnimius of a person. And that's why the Torah is compared to lachem. So a person will say, if I learn Torah, I'm going to make hamoitzi lechem in arts. It's forbidden for even the tzaddik who has a ruchnistic life, which says that I feel like I'm eating bread now because that's how alive Torah is in me. How would I mamish feel like I'm eating something as if I was eating bread? But if you were to make the bracha hamoitzi lechem in arts and learning Torah, there'd be a bracha levatala, a bracha of waste. Although the tzaddik feels the effect of Torah. So much so that the Torah comes like bread, becomes part of the muscle, part of the person's being. Nevertheless, the bracha on learning Torah is one of the different versions that we have. The Rebbe quotes here, Torah. Quotes Shulchan Aruch of the Shulchan Aruch Rav. But you make a bracha lasik b'Torah on learning Torah, not invite you lechem menorahs, even if you feel like it's becoming part of you. With the other brachas that we make on learning Torah. You want to make the bracha moitzi lechem. That's only if you eat actual bread. But when the tzaddik does eat bread, so what does it mean that the tzaddik's gashmistic life is ruchnis? What does the Alter Rebbe mean by that in the Igeres HaKodesh? The actual eating the physical bread is a spiritual experience. And he gives an example. This example given, a sipur haidu, we learned just last time, but I'm just going over. The sipur, the story that is known, this divrei Tzemach Tzedek, like the Tzemach Tzedek said, which the Rebbe said in 1966, this is the 100th year. In 1966, it was 100 years from the passing of Tzemach Tzedek. At the point, I believe it was before he passed away. He doesn't see the beam in the roof lying in bed before he passed away. He was on such a spiritual level that he expressed himself as, I don't see the beam. And it's he sees the word of God, the effect of the poil, meaning Hashem, in the nifel, and what he affects, which is the actual beam that keeps it in existence. It means there's the Dvar Hashem that keeps the beam in existence. And he says he sees the koyach hapoil b'nifel, how Hashem made that this beam should come into existence. Although the actual beam took up physical space. And not only that, it kept the ceiling up. Or the house up. It was a central beam. He didn't see the outcome. Hashem's Dvar Hashem makes the beam, and he understands that this is a beam that's created by the Dvar Hashem. He sees the Dvar Hashem that's keeping the beam in existence. And that's what the Alter Rebbe means in the Igeres HaKodesh. What does it mean that the tzaddik's life, when he's in this world, is a spiritual, is not a chayim of flesh, but a chayim of ruchnis, although he's conditioned under the conditions of this world. Like we said before, you want to make hamaitzi, you have to eat a piece of bread. But the experience of eating bread is itself a spiritual experience. Though he's eating lechem, and when he eats the physical lechem, the bread, he makes hamaitzi lechem menorahs. And when he eats the meat, if he has to make a bracha on the meat in the situation that he does, then he makes the shahakol. Though it's physical bread that the tzaddik is consuming. And how do we know he's eating something physical? The fact that only now we can make the bracha because he's eating a physical piece of bread, a physical piece of meat. And you could not make that bracha just on a spiritual concept, let's say learning Torah, which is called lechem, which is called bread. And lechem gashmi only when he eats the physical bread. But everything that exists in this world has a ruchnistic source. Besides the mazel that makes the wheat grow, that is the entire Dvar Hashem, that everything that exists is existing on the Dvar Hashem, it constantly keeps it in existence. So the tzaddik, when the tzaddik eats the bread, it's how the Dvar Hashem, or how the ruchnis was megushem and came into a piece of bread, but it doesn't change, it doesn't disconnect from its ruchnis. It just conceals the ruchnis, and the tzaddik is in touch with the actual source of the existence, as opposed to what seems to be the existence. What gives him pleasure and the energy is directly from the Dvar Hashem in the bread, and you could argue even more, if you want to say, besides the brachas, that the nutrients that you get bread versus what you would get from meat, what you get from fruit and vitamins versus you would get from something else, the tzaddik gets that also. It's not like the tzaddik doesn't get the physical benefits, because the different physical benefits that there is in different foods is itself ruchnis, and the tzaddik is in touch with the ruchnis of that. So what does this come to show us? That even when the neshama, meaning the tzaddik, is in a physical body, The body itself takes space and adds needs. And the body needs to eat. If a tzaddik starves, a tzaddik dies. I mean, in theory, this is in a miraculous existence, but a tzaddik also has the conditions that has to eat. V'shtiya, and has to drink, gashmi, physically. And he called eating like gashmi is any el davar atofel. The gashmi is everything. The body of the tzaddik is gashmis, and the bodies and the person, the tzaddik's interaction with the world's gashmis is all the tuffle of how it comes. He sees the gashmis, he eats the gashmis, but it's the ruchnis that's in the gashmis. The vushich chitzanis, but for the tzaddik, this is only external. Like we said in the last class, we find this is a makar gemara to this. Hillel Zaken. It says, I'm going to do a favor with my body. Why? Because Hillel was a tzaddik. Yeah, the famous story of the Alter Rebbe. When the Alter Rebbe ate the food in the house, I think of Reb Shlomo Kalina, or Reb Shlomo Kalina came as a guest to the Alter Rebbe, and they salted the soup or the chalk, the famous story. Everyone was eating it and everyone was salty. Reb Shlomo couldn't eat it, it was so salty. He asked the Alter Rebbe, how could you eat it? It's inedible, it's so salty. The Alter Rebbe says that he taught himself already, but the Magidim is rich, never not to taste the gashmis of food. It means he knew that this is food, he knew this is chicken, this is chalk, he knew the bracha you have to make exactly. But he's going to say that it's too salty, that he wasn't in touch with. Yisayim is that there says more. Sha'aguf hagashmi einei afilu b'derech tafel. And here the Rebbe takes it even further. Because in order to be able to get to Ma'azar B'chaim, there can't be any kind of dependency on the Gashmis. There's the definition of the Gashmis, there's the restrictions of the Gashmis, there's how the Gashmis consumes other Gashmis, but all that is not even beyond even Tafel. Why? Because if it was Tafel, it would be secondary, but it would take apart. You have something secondary, right? Then you have Tafel and Iker, like when you have to make a bracha. So you say, what's the primary food and what's the secondary food? The secondary food also is it's a food, it's secondary, it's a food, it's something. If the Gashmis would be secondary and the Ruchnis would be primary, but still the Gashmis takes up a secondary position. So here the Rebbe goes further that in order for it to be Mazar B'chaim on that level of a Nasi, is afilu b'derech tafel, it's not even a tafel, it's not even a secondary, meaning there's no even secondary existence of the Gashmis, although there's the need for the Gashmis, meaning to say that you need to eat the bread to make a bracha, you need to eat the bread to get the nourishment from the bread. But all of that, it's 100% ruchnis, not even a tafel, not even a secondary of Gashmis. Given she'eni ela kli, the Gashmis is only literally a vessel. Hashem says that there has to be a physical world. In order for the neshama to be a neshama to come down to this world and be poil and be effective in this world, it has to interact with Gashmis. So the Gashmis is just literally a method for the neshama to be effective in this world, but not even a method that would be considered secondary, which secondary again is not primary, but still something. In order to be able to do things in this physical world, you need a hand, you need feet, and other of the 248 limbs. Moving. So now we understand. Let's go back to the Marzar Rechaim. And of course, it's not just going to be an idea of teaching us. Like the Rebbe always does, it's not just to teach us about the greatness of the Frierdiker Rebbe or the greatness of a Nasi, that Nasi still is alive. But what does this mean to us? And what does this mean not just to us as an idea? But what does it mean to how do we change and live and act based on this information? So the Rebbe says, and from this is understood, notwithstanding over the fact that the Gemara says about Yaakov Avinu and nevertheless, they said they physically wrapped his body in the preservatives and they buried his body in Hebron. Yaakov Avinu Leimes, Yaakov didn't die. Why? And absolutely didn't die. Like the Rebbe says, the Gemara does not walk back the statement. The Gemara only explains this statement. And not in a way of changing the meaning of what Yaakov Avinu Leimes means, that Yaakov really did die, but his legacy is alive. But you don't know if you know what it means that Yaakov Avinu was alive, then you're going to understand that Yaakov Avinu Leimes, he doesn't die. You only think Yaakov Avinu dies if you misunderstand what it means for Yaakov Avinu to be alive. If you're going to explain that Yaakov Avinu Leimes means a legacy, means that Yaakov Avinu lived like everyone else lived. 120 years, 147 years, the life of Yaakov Avinu. The only thing is that he left influence, his children are alive. We're not changing the translation what it means Yaakov's alive. We're just meaning that Yaakov didn't die because he continues to influence, he continues to guide even. Here the Rebbe doesn't go different, no. We're not walking back the statement, just like when the Gemara was taken aback, so to say, by the statement Yaakov Avinu lo meis, which means Yaakov's alive, he didn't die. That statement still stands. The only difference is that you don't understand what Yaakov Avinu is alive means. If you understand what Yaakov Avinu alive means, then you can understand what it means Yaakov Avinu lo meis, Yaakov didn't die. So the Gemara says why. So the Rebbe next says why. Because what does it mean chantu chantai that they preserved, so to say, his body? The physical body, yeah, sure. Physical body was anointed with all those anointments. And if this was talking about another person, even a Jewish person, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, because this person, when this person was in this world, the Gashmis was the primary of this person's being. Who am I? Right? Neshama shenasata bi means that B is not the neshama. You're saying the neshama that you've given me, who's me? Me is the person. And that's the Gashmi Seker, that's the primary. And you've given me a neshama. But this person is able to understand, recognize that everything you do in this world should be for the sake of heaven. So you, as a physical person, knows how to do the kavanah to be driven and guided by everything you do should be the Shem Shemaim for the sake of heaven. I feel, that's if the person is holding on such a level. Even if a person is on a higher level, that's not just the Shem Shemaim, but everything the person does is a way of showing, knowing God. The person still, the primary is the Gashmis, and he takes the Gashmis. Mechol derechecha means in all your Gashmis, he knows that this is my Gashmis, but in all my Gashmis, I know God. Because your definition of life, again, to understand properly what means Yaakov Avinu lo meis, you have to understand what means Yaakov Avinu is alive. The mistake a person makes in misunderstanding what it means Yaakov Avinu lo meis is because you don't understand what it means Yaakov Avinu is alive. But that's Yaakov Avinu. But a regular person who's alive means they're alive the way we understand it, even on the most highest level of focus and avoida. It's nevertheless you're taking the physical, and through that you're serving Hashem. The person's primary is their body and their physical interactions in the world, although you could guide it to be in a avoida of the Shem Shemaim or B'chol Dechecha. So that person, if the person is alive, and what does it mean the person is alive is defined by their Gashmias. So if the Gashmias is not there, they're not alive anymore. They're dead. They passed away. There's Misa. Because what makes them alive is their Gashmias. So if that's not there anymore, then there's a situation of passing away. But if you're talking about a Nasi, everyone's going to say this is not every tzaddik. This is a Nasi. We're talking about a tzaddik like a nasi. We're talking about a person who. What does it mean that the person's alive? He's not alive of physical flesh, but it's the whole existence is the spirituality of it. Shem Emunah. What is like the Alter Rebbe saying in the Geras HaKodesh? The life of the tzaddik is Emunah, belief, yira, fear, ba'ava, and love. And just like we said, how do you fulfill the mitzvah of aviyira, to love, to fear, to believe? Like the Alter Rebbe says, your heartbeat should run when you think about God. Just like when you have love for something, your heartbeat gets excited. You should flush for God, and that means it affects your physical being. The physical. But the tzaddik is only secondary to the primary, which is the neshama. Even more so. That even the physical, not just that they have your shemaim, they feel it, but then the whole physical is only secondary. If you take away the physical, which is not the primary of that person, it's only the secondary. There was no death. Because what was the life? The life wasn't death. If this, again, by defining the life is what you know what death means. If the life isn't about the physical, so if the physical death doesn't affect the life, because the life was never defined by that. Is he and you want to say that yes, the body was chantu, they put on the ointments and they buried it in Hebron, but it has nothing to do. That wasn't Yaakov Avinu Chai. Therefore, it's not Yaakov Avinu Meis. The primary never died. Primary is still alive. But Pratis Yosef, that is even more so. Here the Rebbe says it's not just that this, where it goes even deeper, it's not just the primary, secondary, that's the whole mitzvah is ruchnis. Yehudi tzaddik, they can even be a tzaddik who's righteous, and everything the tzaddik is on the highest level. Not everyone fits that description. Not everyone fits in what the Alter Rebbe is talking about, that there's no misa. Why? Because the whole Chaim is Chaim Ruchni. Yes, this person spent their whole life studying Torah, performing the mitzvahs. That person didn't become an entity of spirituality, that there's no more Gashmis. He made over, or she made over the Gashmis into Ruchnis, and that became the primary Chaim of who they are. Their primary definition of their life and their being did not turn into Ruchnis. They did every second in Torah and every second in mitzvahs. When the person learned Torah, they learned Torah 100%. When that person ate physical food, and said the right brachas for them. However, that person was still in touch with their physical. They tasted the food, not the Dvar Hashem, that the Ruchnis is in the food. And the taste makes a difference. Like the story that the other tzaddik said, I can't eat it, it's too salty. It could be such a situation where the importance of the taste could even affect if you can make a bracha or not. If the person tastes the food and the food is not to their liking, that would affect if they're able to make a bracha hana, then they're not taking pleasure, they're not enjoying it. Because they taste the food, they can't make a bracha. Why? Because the definition of making the bracha means you have to enjoy it, and because you're in touch not with the spiritual but the physical doesn't appeal to you, so it affects if you can make a bracha or not. Claimer, you do live a spiritual life, but that's not who you are. You also have the physical. There are two things within the person. Because you also have the physical, the flesh, that could even confuse. Okay, it's like we said before, affect if you can make a bracha or not. So if that person passes away, it's at least a partial primary of the person's existence. You can't say that nothing affected that person, because now that person doesn't have taste, because the person is not physically alive anymore. The physical took a big part. It doesn't have to take a primary part, but at least an equal part or a secondary part that's almost primary. You can't say it's not death, because what defines the person as alive was a little bit the physical. The physical is not alive anymore, then there was a death. Is if you can't say, okay, that he didn't totally die, but this katla paga, like the Gemara says, what's a partial death make the difference? If you're not 100% alive, you're not alive. To that person, you could say there's a concept of misa. So what does it mean 100% that Yaakov doesn't die? Is again, the Rebbe says, what does it mean? You see the child's alive, you see the person's alive, and you can say, oh, this person's alive. It's breathing, walking, talking. That's exactly how Yaakov Avinu is alive. Why? Because by Yaakov Avinu, his primary, almost 100% of the Rebbe, it's not even secondary. The whole mitzvah of the Yaakov Avinu is ruchnis. So nothing, the Gashmus was pasha lavush, a garment, for expressing up to a certain point of his life. But so the garment to it, the person, it was almost like a person takes off a clothing. Can't say the person's not alive. I'm not wearing clothing, but I'm still alive. I'm naked, but I'm alive. Yaakov Avinu leimeis. Do you see the child's life? You see this? Yeah, the child's life. Yaakov Avinu is ma'azar b'chaim mafu b'chaim. Why? Because when he was alive, he was never defined by the secondary of the physicality. Yaakov Avinu doesn't even partially die. For that to be, it has to be that no part of his who he is alive is the physical. Not even say a little bit. Or half. The physical doesn't define the person at all. Therefore, there's no death at all. There was a change, but not a death. It's only an external garment. You can't say if the person dressed changes their clothing, that now I'm wearing a spiritual clothing, no longer the physical body, that I'm not alive. I was never defined by life by being in a physical body. So far, so the Rebbe is explaining up until this point. We're going to stop here and continue the Sicha, fabulous Sicha, because we have to go further and further. The point is to get to what the Rebbe wants to explain, that the Mazar B'chaim is not just that the children are a way to define to see that if you see the physical son, then you know Yaakov's still alive, the Rebbe is still alive, the Nasi is still alive. But even more than that, if you see the son alive, how is the son alive? Why is the child alive? It's only because the Yaakov's alive. Yaakov's alive, although the Rebbe is going to add to the avoided the dependency that you as a chassid, we have an obligation to be alive. Because at the end of the day, the Hu B'chaim is dependent on Zara B'chaim, but why B'chlal is Zara B'chaim is because Hu B'chaim. That we'll get to hopefully in the next class or the class after. Shkoyach for joining, and Hashem will continue tomorrow.